Hello, bonjour, and welcome to your new RT1 Exchange video. Welcome to this channel where we taste, explore and explain together the wonderful world of wine. This is episode number 4 of our series about the prestigious sparkling wines from the French region of Champagne. Here we're progressively explaining the different facets of what makes these fantastic wines so unique and interesting. After looking into different grapes, the varied terroirs and the sweetness levels of Champagne in previous episodes, today we're covering the difference you may have heard about without necessarily understanding very well between non-vintage and a vintage cuvée. What does that all mean and why you should know about this if you care at all about Champagne? Let's go! You probably already know that the huge majority of champagnes, probably well over 90% of them, are what we call non-vintage. And if you did not know, well, that's something you've already learned today. So what is a non-vintage champagne? Why is it called that way? Most champagnes do not come with a vintage, a year stated on the label, as opposed to most other wines, right? And that's simply because these non-vintage champagnes are blends of different wines produced during different years. Generally, a NV champagne, which is how we sometimes nickname them, are made from a fairly large proportion of wine made during one particular year. Let me put myself in the shoes of a champagne winemaker here. Say I am a champagne winemaker, and this year in 2020 I need to make a new blend for my non-vintage cuvée. I'll probably use, say, 70 or 80% of wine from vintage 2018 as my base, to which I will blend a bit of 2017, a little bit of 2016 as well, perhaps a touch of 2015 that I have somewhere left over in my winery. And because it's my house's signature, I always use, say, 2-3% of a few wines matured in oak barrels for around 10 years. So I'd add a barrel of wine from 2010, one from 2011 and half a barrel from 2009. Next year I will do the same, but rather than using as my 75% vintage base the vintage 2018 as I'm doing this year, because of course I will have run out of 18 wine next year, I'll use mainly wines from 2019 in 2021, with a little bit of all of the other vintages that I used, but shifted by 1 year. Does that make sense? So why do champagne makers do this? There are two main reasons for this, both related to consistency. Legally, it's a requirement ruled by the appellation laws that every winery every year in Champagne is required to put aside to stock up a portion of their wine and to keep it in their cellar, generally in tanks, for a while. This is a stock volume of wine that is called the réserve. Understand? Reserve, obviously. That's when the vineyard yield is good, when you have a good year, good vintage conditions that allow to produce a normal or good volume of wine. They have to store some of this wine up for later somewhere in the winery. Now, if a bad year strikes, which is fairly common in Champagne because of rain, because of hail, because of spring frost, which do happen regularly because Champagne is a very cold region, wineries are then allowed to use more of these reserve wines to compensate a bad production volume for one particular vintage. This prevents wineries to go bankrupt at any weather event or bad weather event. It allows a more consistent output year on year to keep their distribution chain active because they don't run out of wine to sell, the cash flow obviously, the brand loyalty as well, etc. Because there's always wine coming out even from an area that is prone to weather incidents. Does that make sense? Now, the side effect of this legal constraint is actually a huge benefit in terms of quality of the wine as well, leading us to reason number 2. Non-vintage champagnes allow for a greater consistency of style. Let's see how this works. Because Champagne is generally so cold as a region, it is the coldest wine region in France after all. The characteristics of wines produced every vintage can vary pretty significantly year on year. Between a warmer year like vintage 2015 or vintage 2009, for example, that will give rounder and riper wines with more tropical fruit notes in the wines, and a very cold year that will deliver grassier, more citrusy, more tangy wines with more acidity, more minerality to them. When you like a brand of champagne, you don't want it to change too much every time you buy it. You want a little touch of tropical, a little touch of lemon, the little brioche texture or whatever. You want it to be exactly the same every time you buy it, because it's your favorite brand of champagne after all, right? This is only possible by blending different vintages, some wine from the warmer vintages, some wine from the colder vintages, to balance things out. And you can do that every year, because you never get 10 or 5 years that are very hot or very cold in a row. Also, the reserve wine we talked about that are stored at the winery for a while. What is great is that these wines actually increase in quality through these few years of aging. They mellow, they deepen, they complexify, they get better with age. Yes, reserve wines are very thought after and positive in a blend by winemakers and consumers. And of course, if you've produced enough wine this year, you don't have to stock up always more and more wine. You can tap into your older reserve and replace it with new one, as long as you keep this safety net volume intact or alive. So you can use better, slightly matured and mellowed reserve wine in your blend, and you actually get a much better wine overall because of this. This is one of the secrets of Champagne. Because the region is legally obligated to store wine as reserve, which is very expensive but also actually make the wine better, they can actually make better wine always. Most sparkling winemaking wineries around the world don't necessarily do that because it's so expensive. It's shooting yourself in the foot from a treasury perspective, but it's great for quality. And that's what they do in Champagne. And you may be wondering then, if blending vintages is so great, Julien, why then bother making or buying vintage champagnes? And if you know your champagne, you probably know that vintage champagnes are more expensive as well. So let's explain. As you've understood, vintage champagnes are made from grapes from one single year, as opposed to non-vintage blends, and this is why they come with a vintage written on the label. So why are vintage champagnes generally considered better and are more expensive if you consider what I've just explained before? That's simply because champagne makers made a lot less vintage champagne than they make non-vintage. The non-vintage is a little more entry-level trim if you wish, the bulk of what they make, even though they are also very well crafted, don't get me wrong, but they make more of it. While the vintage cuvées are more handcrafted highlights of what a winery can do best. They take their best vineyards, their best grapes that they cherish and carefully ferment and mature at the winery, often in very small batches, and they make as good a wine as they can make with that particular vintage year, conditions, climate, etc, etc. It's a little bit like ready-to-wear versus haute couture in fashion, if you see what I mean. It's not really the same scale or involvement. So of course, vintage champagnes usually are better wines and more expensive. And champagne connoisseurs like those cuvées because they do vary a little bit every year. It showcases the year's specific vintage conditions as well. So if you like to really understand every vintage of champagne, every house and what happened a little bit at the winery, if you like to have a slightly different wine every year as well, not exactly the same wine you already had last time and hundreds of times, then that's when you want a vintage champagne. And that's why wineries make it as well, and that's why people buy them. Less consistent are the vintage cuvées, but perhaps more interesting also because they are less consistent. Now, it is not always true that vintage is better than non-vintage. Some champagne makers take advantage of the greater diversity and freedom that they have from being able to blend several vintages together in one non-vintage, yet they handcraft them meticulously, small batch by small batch, like they would for a vintage. But they can actually combine the very best wines from different years. It can be an advantage. It's like a blend of vintage cuvées, if you wish, so that they can be even greater and more complete wines. And that's what the famous, typically Krug champagne house does with their Grand Cuvée, for example. But some small champagne makers also do this, so don't just disregard the non-vintage champagnes as being of lower quality. There are exceptions, and they are also very well crafted wines. The art of blending is very powerful in champagne. As I said, it's one of the secrets of champagne's success and its unmatched quality around the world, pretty much. I hope this illustrated exactly that. And let's leave it here for today, and thanks for watching. Make sure to stay tuned to continue along the journey of learning more about champagne and about fine and rare wine in general with the RT Wine Exchange channel. I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers. Santé.